Right, ladies and gentlemen, what an engaging discussion that was. And first of all, I'd like to compliment all of you at nearly 5:30 in the evening after a full day of listening to stuff on this really interesting subject of sustainability. You are still here. So thank you very much for continuing to be here. If I can please request the panelists from the previous session to perhaps take a seat or continue this really engaging conversation outside. That'll help everyone here. This session, ladies and gentlemen, is all about hearing from our network partners of the B20, the network partners of the B20, and that's why it is a different session to the other sessions you've attended so far. It is also different because I was looking at the two-day panel after panel agenda for this event. This is the only panel that mentioned the acronym ESG, right? The acronym ESG, this is the only panel that mentioned that acronym. Now, that acronym itself, I'd like to introduce and say a few words, but before that, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Vishesh Chandyok. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Grant Thornton Bharat. We are 10,000 people in our GT family, the largest amongst all GT member firms around the world, focused on assurance and consulting around 5 ecosystems. And that's probably why I was asked to moderate this panel. The first ecosystem there is climate and energy transition. That's an ecosystem that we're shaping. The second one's automation. Third one's inclusion. Fourth one is competitiveness. And fifth one is private capital. I've myself been at the forefront of talking to Indian promoters, Indian families about the need to adopt governance in the family and in the business for over 30 years since I started in this profession. I am a member of the CII National Council. I also am a co-opted member on the council of the ICWA and sit on the board of IIM Ahmedabad. So that's a little bit about myself and about Grant Thornton Bharat. I'd like to very briefly also introduce our distinguished panel here, our network partners of the B20. We've got with us Scarlett One-and-Wish, Collective Action Specialist at the Basil Institute on Governance. We've got John Bolton, Director Policy at the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. We've got, next to John, Dr. Kalpana Sithipalli, Director ESG at Deutsche Bank, Asia Pacific, of course, requires no introduction. And we've got Mr. Scott Hansen, Director Policy and Global Engagement at the International Federation of Accountants, IFAC. That is our distinguished panel, ladies and gentlemen. So before I tell you a little bit more about each of those panelists and we get to ask them questions, I will start with asking them a few questions and then hope to open up to allow you all to ask some questions. Let me introduce the topic, ESG integration in governance, and where I started off. So ESG, as that acronym is under 2 decades old, the UN first mentioned it in 2004, and it said we ought to bring in environment, social, and governance factors when we look at investment decisions. I'm sure Kalpana will touch on that in her comments. But it took 15 years. It took 15 years for that acronym to start getting mentioned on earnings calls. So even in those 15-year period between 2004 and 2018, only 1% of S&P 500 earnings calls, only 1% mentioned the acronym ESG. That very suddenly went up from 2018 to 2021 towards 20, 25, 30% out of the top end of the S&P 500. That was the extent of shift in that period from 2018. Even middle market businesses, private businesses, and we researched this in our Grant Thornton International Business Report. In the 2021 survey, 62% of middle market businesses said ESG was not just a good to have, but a must have. So it's not only something for the very big companies, it is something everybody's looking at. So that's a little bit of the background, but you'll ask me what. And I, like keeping things simple, I'd say the E, break it down into its parts. The climate, environment, energy transition. The S, the previous panel talked about that, the social agenda, the DEI agenda, as well as the health and safety agenda. And then the G, the various layers of defense that an organization builds, right? Anti-bribery, corruption, EWRM, et cetera, but we will talk more about that. Of course, there was a big moment, and I'll finish with this, on the 26th of June, 2023. Just like the business I come from, the IASB, the International Accounting Standards Board, sets global accounting standards, IFRS, and almost the entire world has moved to IFRS, which has allowed us to communicate in a common language when we look at financial information, right? More than 100 countries have adopted that IFRS. What happened on that 26th of June is IASB's sister body, the ISSB, released the first two sustainability standards, the S1 and S2. The hope now really is that those standards will also pave the way for a common way for everybody to communicate on sustainability matters across the world. Will that help reduce what people call greenwashing, just like IFRS helped get more consistency and understanding across the world? Will that help moving away from just a tick-in-the-box approach of some of the past frameworks towards a more compliance in substance? Let's try and hear from some of our panelists and begin this panel discussion and understand what impact that big shift, in my view, at least, is going to have. So very quickly, let me introduce the panel and give you a little bit of background about each individual. Scott Hansen, as I said, is from IFAC. He leads IFAC's policy and advocacy related to anti-corruption, anti-money laundering, AML, and economic crime. He has led IFAC's engagement with the B20 since Saudi Arabia, then Italy, then the Indonesian presidencies, and now the Indian presidency. So he's been on this sort of panel before. Thank you, Scott, for making time for us. John Bolton, as I said, Director Policy at ICWA. He has, like myself, been an auditor, has also been a preparer of financial statements, and an analyst of listed company corporate reporting. Scarlett is a collective action specialist, and I'm sure she'll tell us what a collective action specialist is, but she is with the Basil Institute, and she's been there since 2017, and she heads the Institute's engagement with B20, the Basil Institute and Governance's engagement with the B20. And then Dr. Kalpana, as I said earlier, requires no introduction. Deutsche Bank requires no introduction, but she was previously with the World Bank and leads the work at Deutsche Bank on results frameworks, measurement, monitoring, and sustainable finance taxonomies for ESG transactions. She has over 20 years of experience in sustainable finance across more than 15 countries. So she is a real specialist on this subject across the world. So may I start with you, Scott? And if I could ask you to please, maybe each one of you very briefly, introduce the organization you belong to. So tell the audience more about IFAC.
Sure, thank you very much. And is this on? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. Thank you very much, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here in Delhi today. I'm looking forward to the rest of the conference and the summit, the B20 summit later this week. So IFAC is the International Federation of Accountants. The way I like to describe us is we're like the United Nations of national accounting bodies around the world. We have 180 member bodies in 130 different countries around the world. And through those members, we represent roughly 3.5 million professional accountants around the world. So in India, we have both the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, ICAI, and the Institute of Cost Accountants, ICMA India. So two of our major member organizations here in India. In the context of the G20 and B20, all of the accountancy bodies in all of the G20 countries are members of IFAC. So our role is really twofold. One, we support global standards and high quality in all of those member organizations. So we support the International Audit and Assurance Standards Board and the International Ethics Standards Boards for accountants. So we ensure that all these national accounting bodies around the world have high quality standards and produce high quality accountants. Our second role is engaging at the global level on behalf of the global accountancy profession. So I'll be talking a bit more about that later, but that's where our role in the B20, the OECD, United Nations, all of that comes into play. In the context, as a final point of the business community and the global business community, there's perhaps no profession or no group that's more connected throughout small businesses, large businesses, public sector in every country in the world. So we try to bring together all of that expertise to push forward policy debates, and in particular the ESG agenda. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So really the consistency and the frameworks, not across the world, across all the accounting bodies of the world is what the IFAC looks at. Thank you, Scott. John, could you introduce the ICAW, the UK Institute of Chartered Accountants?
So ICAW is a professional accountancy body. We are a global body based in London. Our roots is the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. And our vision is one of a world of sustainable economy. So sustainability is really at the heart of what we do as a professional body. But you know, to all of us as a business audience here today, what is it about ESG that the accountancy profession can contribute to? You know, what is it that we bring to this debate? And there's really something around how do you think about regulation, increasingly important. We're getting to a stage now where the regulation of sustainability reporting is becoming mature. It's accelerating very rapidly. What businesses are expected to do, required to do, what they need to do for capital markets, what they need to do for government is very rapidly changing. And accountants are at the heart of that. They are people who help businesses keep ahead of regulation, and in particular in a capital markets context, how do you ensure that you are transparent in a way that you're not only complying, but you're building confidence and trust in your business. So that's where the profession has come from. But if you think beyond regulation, as we move into actually putting sustainability at the heart of business, you've then got a real challenge around capacity. How do I build the capabilities, the ability within my business to do this? How do I have an ecosystem of people around me that I can trust, who support me in that journey, who really understand and speak this language? And that is what the professional bodies have been doing since inception. Professional bodies about qualifications, it's about supervision, it's about making sure people are equipped to do the work that the economy and society needs them to do. But it's also about building new skills and having the frameworks, having the institutional framework that can enable people to learn new skills and to be held to account for really knowing what they're doing. And so it's in that context that we're really encouraged and pleased to be part of this debate today.
Yeah, so the ICAI equivalent in England and Wales is what the ICAW is, but their vision is to promote sustainable economies. And I believe that's been the vision since 2015. So you were a pioneer with that sort of vision. Scarlett, maybe if I can ask you very quickly to introduce the Basil Institute, because Deutsche Bank doesn't require any introduction. Dr. Abner, I'll come to you with a question straight after this.
Thank you. Yes, so we are not an accountancy body. We are a foundation in Switzerland, as the title HQ there, but working pretty globally with local offices in pretty much all continents of the world. But as the title and the name might suggest, sort of our focus is governance. But overall from our work, where that really comes from is the focus on specifically anti-corruption. And to positively communicate that, of course, governance, strong governance, is one way of addressing these risks and corruption-related risks. We work not only with the private sector, but also with government, civil society, as well. In my team, in the collective action team, private sector division, it's very much focused on companies and really looking to address how can companies come together, how can we have a business-focused discussion on topics that have typically been very government-owned. How can we bring the private sector to the table? And I think we'll go into what collective action means in a bit, but I'm very excited to, for this topic that we're looking at ESG integration in governance specifically on this panel, because I think there's been a lot of discussion that the G in ESG hasn't maybe been quite up there with a big focus on the environmental side of things, and then human rights and social coming in there as well. And I think it's always an interesting question. Are we integrating ESG into governance, ESG, or are we also looking at how governance underpins everything that is happening in the ESG discussion? So I think sometimes it looks like we have three pillars, but they're also interconnected. And I think breaking up those silos and those discussions and building those bridges is sort of key to really having impactful ESG. And I think the B20 policy paper is definitely one step in the right direction there. So thank you.
Thank you, Scarlett. So really, IFAC, ICAW, and the Basil Institute, and these are, at the heart of enabling those ecosystems around E, S, and G. And maybe, we will talk more about the work they're doing around capacity building and the amazing tools they have that can support all of us on that journey to the extent we want to leverage them. We'll come to that shortly. Let's first hear from somebody from the private sector. Dr. Kalpana, on the role of financial institutions in promoting ESG integration within the companies they invest in, and all to whom you provide financial services to. What is the role of financial institutions, Kalpana?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can, yes.
So as providers of capital, financial institutions are indeed primary drivers of sustainable finance or ESG compliant transactions. So that is the big picture. But under that headline, there are a number of distinct, diverse elements, and I'd like to touch specifically on three. First, on financed emissions. Every dollar that we lend to our clients or arrange for our clients, the emissions associated with what those proceeds or those monies are used for, those come back and sit on our books as Scope 3 emissions, as our financed emissions. Now, our karma, therefore, is inextricably linked to what our clients do. So therefore, it's in our interest to work with our clients to help them transition to low carbon pathways so that, over time, their emissions come down, as do the emissions, Scope 3 emissions, that sit on our books. Now, you'd say that, yeah, but then, ESG is more than just emissions, and you're right. This brings me to my second point, which is on ESG structuring, which is we work with our clients and help them identify what are the core ESG issues that are material to their business, to their firm, and we tailor specific quantitative KPIs which they use to measure, monitor, track progress on their ESG performance and report to the market. Now, that's powerful signaling because you have a client going out to the market and saying, I am committing to meeting these KPIs, and if I don't, there will be financial consequences. In that, if I meet the KPI, I get a discount. If I don't meet it, I get a penalty. Okay? The third point on disclosures. In recent years, there has been a lot of halla around greenwashing, right? And the latest now is green hushing. Client after client comes and says, I don't know, man, my boss told me to put ESG in every transaction I do, and I did. And now I have the NGOs coming after me. And what's more, regulators issuing taxonomies galore. And there's a lot of pressure. So that's where disclosure is coming. Disclosures are a hedge against greenwashing. And what we do, our clients, the KPIs that we structured for them under our ESG structuring line of business, they use those same KPIs as disclosures. And they disclose their ESG progress to the regulator, to markets, to NGOs. And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Scott, if I may come to you. So as Dr. Kalpana said, she really focused on those Scope 3 emissions, the E part of ESG, and then also talked about the greenwashing, green hushing. I talked a little bit about that earlier when I said, the most used acronym, and now actually the new most used acronym is artificial intelligence, by the way, in those earnings calls, which is which people are using for similar, I don't know, data hushing or automation hushing, if we can call it that. So let's move track a little bit. How does IFAC collaborate with other global organizations, Scott, as a network partner of the B20, in order to foster a more coordinated and comprehensive approach to ESG integration?
Absolutely. So I think, and if you suffer me a moment or two to start with, what are we really trying to achieve?
Yeah.
And I think there's been great progress on coming to some sort of global consensus around the goal here. And that's ESG information on the same level as traditional financial information. And so what does that mean? It means that ESG information should be as decision useful and as high quality and as reliable as traditional financial reporting, so that investors, capital markets, other stakeholders can make decisions based on that information, and we can get the outcomes we're trying to achieve from a policy perspective. So when you put that as the sort of goal, you step back and think about the context here. Okay, so we're trying to get ESG information on the same level as traditional financial reporting. Mm-hmm. So we've been letting traditional financial reporting evolve for effectively 6,000 years. If you go back to the earliest origins of writing in ancient Sumeria, we're talking about counting bushels of wheat, sheep, things like that. And so over time, you get to the 1400s, the development of double entry bookkeeping accounting. You get to the 1840s, the start of professional accountancy bodies like ICWA, and then into the 1970s when you get the movement towards globalization of standards. So we've been working on financial reporting for the entirety of written history, effectively. Now, if you put that as the counterpoint to where we are with ESG information, we've really been working on that for 25 years. And as we're in a climate emergency situation, we don't have 6,000 years to let ESG information develop organically. So we're trying to make that happen as fast as we possibly can. The good news is we have a lot of stakeholders working together and trying to coordinate to make that happen as efficiently and effectively as possible. So that brings back to the question at hand, what does IFAC do as this United Nations of accountancy bodies? What are we doing to collaborate with other organizations around the world? So it's important to think about the key stakeholders here. So there's the regulators and the policymakers. At the global level, that's represented by an organization called IOSCO, the International Organization of Securities Commissions. For example, SEBI in India is a member there. So we have IOSCO, the regulators. We have the companies. Business at OECD, for example, the B20, these type of unions of companies around the world bring that perspective together. We have other stakeholders, such as the Basil Institute, civil society organizations that have a key interest in this because, again, ESG information is broader interest than just financial reporting. And then we have the standard setters, like the ISSB, and then the International Audit and Assurance Standards Board, International Ethics Standards Board for Accountants. So the important thing here is that we're all talking to one another. We've been focused on developing ESG information to the highest quality level for years at this point, and we've had great success. I think we have broad alignment on the ISSB standards. We have broad alignment on companies wanting harmonization there, and we're all moving in the right direction. So fantastic progress.
No, thank you, Scott. And I must compliment you. I mean, getting alignment on accounting standards was a journey. It took some time, but as I said now, there are, I mean, pretty much every major country, every major economy now has adopted a common set of accounting standards. So it's great to see after 25 years, we've also got something, what I talked about with S1 and S2, as a similar opportunity with sustainability standard. But let me ask you here, Scott, if I may, do you find that it's the developed countries who are signing on to these international standards first, or are members of the so-called Global South also showing interest? Because in India, as you know, SEBI's gone ahead and released their own BRSR, first applicable to the top 1,000 companies, and then hopefully they'll expect others to pick it up, the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Report, BRSR.
So I think the good news here is that we see both. So for example, soon after the ISSB was announced at COP27, I believe it was, we saw, or COP26, we've seen countries like Nigeria, Zimbabwe, other key Global South countries announce that they want to sign on to ISSB standards as soon as possible. And the reason being, they see this as an opportunity to inject themselves into the global capital markets, to draw investors to those countries. So we see a lot of global North uptake, United Kingdom, Japan, others, and then global South uptake as well. At the same time, we see dissenters in both groups. So we see the European Union obviously moving forward with their own set of standards. We see India moving forward with its own set of standards. But the hope is that this is all coming together. Again,
and make the audience understand, what are some of the finer points where people may dissent, or where they may have differences of opinion?
Absolutely. So I think when you look at the global North dissent, the European dissent, it's that they want more robust reporting standards. They want more to be harmonized. So they want to do more. I think when you look at the India dissent, for example, it's based on maybe the content, the specific content of what's being harmonized, whether it fairly treats developing country SMEs, whether it fairly treats purchasing power parity issues and carbon intensity and things to that effect. So you see dissent from different angles, but again, the hope is that the ISSB will be a global baseline. Then we can build country-specific requirements on top of it, but ultimately over time we move towards a very harmonized system. So again, you get that global comparability and decision useful information for investors the world over.
Exactly. And I think that's the journey we've already treaded with financial reporting standards, because India had participation at the board, which came up with those standards. And that was the way, for everybody to say, participate in the standard setting, but then everybody should adopt a common language. What does a common language do? It does exactly what it's doing in this room. Enable everybody to understand each other, or at least have the ability to potentially understand each other, right? Versus all of us speaking different languages. The same thing is there with the ISSB also now. I think Mr. Kaushik Chatterjee of the Tata Group is on the ISSB representing India and those Indian views. So let me, in the interest of time, Scott, if it's okay, move on to John. John, tell us more about the ICAEW's capacity building and professional development initiatives for accountants, and in order for those accountants to be able to meet the growing demand for ESG-related services. I can tell you, anybody who has ESG on their visiting card will get an interview at our firm just now.
And that's a great point, isn't it? Because we're at a real pivotal moment for the whole of economy and society. We're going through, we're at the start of this transition where this is really important to business. But how do you start on that journey? Because we know how to measure cash, I think. I think we're pretty familiar by now to work out how cash flows through a business and how we can trust that cash that's recorded, that's been generated, is right. And we're also used to complying with the law. I think all businesses would say they've got very robust controls and systems in place so they can be confident that they are complying with what the law requires them to do. But I think the point here, which is different, which I guess is brought together in the summit over the next couple of days, is that this is a new departure, because this is a new source of information. This is something that, some of it is compliance related, it's regulatory required. Some of it is related to cash, but it's also related to a whole host of other things. As Scott said earlier, 6,000 years ago, writing developed as an accounting record, and at that time we didn't have cash, so we were recording sheep and cows and grain, and we kind of worked out that was pretty difficult to count, so we worked out that cash was going to be more suitable. But
Right.
we're at a stage now where we're measuring different things. We're not necessarily set up to do it, but we've got AI. We're much more sophisticated as a global economy. We ought to be up to this challenge. So it's equipping people to be ready to do that and to do it in a way that stands up to scrutiny. When you've got somebody external who's looking in at you, they don't only want to know whether you've made any money this year, they also want to know how much carbon you've emitted, how are you doing on a host of EDI measures, which, by the way, they want to compare against different companies and make sure that they're all comparable. This is going to be a real challenge. It's not a challenge to start, but it will be a challenge to do it in a credible, consistent, transparent way. And it's there that the accountancy profession is really building trust and the tools to help businesses to do that. So our qualification has sustainability built in, so we're putting people out into the market with a badge that makes it easier for businesses to understand who's able to do what. We have a sustainability certificate. It's not only limited to our members, anyone can do it, but it's the start on a journey of helping people to work out how they can think about these issues that they might be quite unfamiliar with. We've got communities, a sustainability community, again, not limited to our members that anyone can join. It's all just about capacity building and information sharing. And one of the things we've been really excited to see come out of the ESG Action Council at the B20 this year is this idea of shared platforms for capacity building. This idea that best practice can be shared between businesses, between regulators and business, because if we end up in a world in 5 years' time where all we have is compliance, where all we have are penalties and fines and concerns for business, and this is put into a compliance box, that's going to be a real missed opportunity. Because what we need is something much more linked into strategy and business. And I think the accounting profession really has a role to play there, and I'm really pleased to be part of the debate today.
Thank you. Yeah. So we took a long time, but we came to a stage where we could measure financial transactions well. How do we gear up to measure, these non-financial things like DEI, energy transition, governance, etc., and the role the accountancy profession can play there. Various communities, what John said, that you can sign up to, which are available not just to ICAW members, but otherwise various courses you can sign up to. Also, if you want to start, building those skills yourself. More common set of standards, and I think this is for both Scarlett as well as Kalpana. We have more consistent standards coming up. We have better training, education, more consistency in measurement, and then hopefully assurance. But aren't financial statements or annual reports, the material out there, getting too complex already to understand for people, right? With IFRS, with fair values, with all this additional information out there. Would any of you like to comment on the sort of extent of information out there to need to digest, particularly for the investment community?
So indeed, there is a whole host of information and disclosures and guidances and so on. It's very easy for firms and investors and banks to feel a bit lost in this vast sea of information. But there's always a starting point. And if you think of it logically, right, you start, say, I'm a bank, I'm lending to a client. You start from, I as my client is at point A and has bought in to the concept of utilizing ESG as a way to enhance its own reputation, as a way to make its own business model or what it does on ESG accretive to its value proposition, to increase its own enterprise value. And once it's able to see, the client is able to see that ESG is not a matter of, oh, you can make money and do good. It is a way of money by doing good. So once that link is clearly established, and that's what we do professionally on a daily basis, we make that connection, we help our clients see that association, At that point, you're saying, okay, so you're starting from point A, and these are a few key material issues to your business, and we help them design their KPIs or metrics, and we go from point A to point B. And there are very specific metrics that can be designed, very credible, completely aligned with S1 and S2. And I'll take a moment here to just comment on what these are. So S1, of course, is industry-specific matrices, which SASB had come out with in the past. And S2, very simply put, is regardless of which industry you're in, the fact is that any industry will be subject to climate vulnerabilities, and S2 is therefore a way to disclose to the investors how vulnerable the client is or the firm is to climate issues or climate risk, if you like. So between these two, it's manageable. It's okay. You're taking a look at yourself and you're saying, okay, I'm at point A, I need to go to point B in 5 years or 2 years or 10 years. And I have interim targets which say, if I need to get there in the next 10 minutes, I have to first get off the stage and then take a step, cross that table, and eventually get there. It's not that complicated to wrap your head around it. And you have specific credible metrics which the investors can see, and they say, okay, great. So you've improved or not your performance, and that's a starting point. And that's all aligned with the common language that you had mentioned, Vishesh.
Yeah. And Kapna, it's not just about yourself, right? You have to do this for your entire value chain. That's where the standards are going. Just like for anti-bribery and corruption, where it's not only for your company, it's actually your entire value chain. Are they, are you giving them training on anti-bribery and corruption and those sort of things? So maybe I ought to ask Scarlett here a little bit around that subject. What is collective action, Scarlett? And tell me about the role of public-private partnerships that organizations like you, try and use to drive this message forward.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. This morning, I heard actually in quite a few of the discussions terms like we need a more holistic approach, terms like, or, slogans like we all need to come together, we can't do it on our own. I think in the panel before the last discussions around we need government and industry to come together. And we hear this a lot, actually, on all of these very complex topics. But the question really is, yes, we all agree we need it, but how do we get there? And that is really where collective action comes in and where collective action comes from. It comes from the discussion around, 20, 25, 30 years ago now, when the whole conversation about corruption-related offenses, internationally, being prosecuted internationally, and sort of the panic in the private sector of how do you deal with this, because the anti-corruption laws were not aligned. There weren't sort of like global standards set in that way. And so there was this push to say, well, actually, the private sector has a real role to play to come to the table and identify standards, develop standards at the industry level, sectoral level, country level, and also, of course, into the global discussion. Of course, we've now moved on and made huge progress in terms of anti-corruption laws, and so that conversation has shifted much more into implementation. How do we overcome the implementation gap? Yes, most big companies, globally operating companies, even medium-sized companies have their anti-corruption compliance programs, but are they being implemented? Is it just a tick box exercise? And so sort of through that process, this is, we've identified ways to engage with companies to, ensure this isn't a zero-sum game. This isn't just about, adding or bringing resources to the table and adding extra requirements onto the private sector, but really a question of how can you sort of, through incentives, address common issues, from the corruption standpoint, but I guess the ESG as well, the anti-competitive element of lack of common standards, right, that are created, how can they be addressed from the private sector perspective in an effective way? And I think the sort of question, because we've been talking about these topics for sort of 20, 30, 40 years, and we've now seen the evolvement of the engagement. The question is, when a new topic or newer topic like ESG comes up, the question is, how can we take from the discussion around sustainability, from the discussion around compliance, anti-corruption, that have been out there for a little bit longer, and input that into the ESG discussion to make sure we're learning and applying those processes. And I mean, we've also seen in the initiatives that we work with that actually building this sort of trusted relationship between private sector and then also government, which is a big part of this too, of how do you engage with government on these topics, is that, you know, private sector then comes to us and says, I know we're technically just talking about anti-corruption compliance, but can we bring the human rights conversation, human rights due diligence, because that's a trusted space, and the private sector really yearns for a trusted place where they can share those experiences with other colleagues, in a space where not everything has to be perfect, and you're not leading necessarily on everything, and you can be open and honest about where the problems are, and then often you identify where those common risks are and how to better address them. So that's really where kind of collective action comes in, and has also sort of grown, beyond just traditional anti-corruption compliance, also to look into green corruption, human rights, and kind of expanded sort of as a practical tool there.
Thank you. Well, you have another session starting in 9 minutes. I would like to give you at least 2 or 3 minutes between this session and the next session, and also make sure we finish on time. Therefore, I've got 2 choices. Either give the chance to everybody on the panel a couple of minutes to wrap up and any final comments they want to make, or allow all of you to ask questions. So I'll go with questions first, if there are any questions, if I see hands. Otherwise, we can hear concluding remarks from those on the audience. Question at the back. Yep. Please keep your question brief. If you could please also introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kapil from Accenture.
Yeah.
My question is around the convergence of various standards.
Yeah.
So we see ISSB now sort of obviously a merger of SASB and TCFT, but then we are seeing ESRS coming up with additional standard and SEC coming up with their own draft. Do you see, and BSRS obviously, so do you see somewhere all of them converging to a single global standard?
Yeah.
Why it's required? Because many companies are, listed across various, countries, so they need...
Thanks, Kapil. I got your question. Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Burning questions? Happy to take 1 or 2 others and help them. Please go ahead. I'll get them to answer them together. So first was convergence of standards. I think we touched on that with S1, S2, but I'm sure.
So hi, everyone. This is Venkat, Ambassador Sustainability.
Yeah.
It's a touchy, sensitive question, but I would want you to answer it to the best possible extent. The fact that we have seen a lot of, green hushing, green washing, green layering. I've been a former Swiss banker, so I have seen how things happen over multiple layers.
Of course.
And predominantly, this has been very easy for many people to indulge in washing or hushing. Now, no matter, as Mr. Accenture said, what are the standards that are going to come up and convergence of standards is concerned. The fact of the matter is, from an audit standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint, how can we put regulations and enforcements and controls that can bring this down to the bare minimum in order to have respectable reporting?
Got your question. So convergence, and the second is the monitoring framework around getting when people don't get it right. The monitoring framework, just like there is on financial reporting, should there be, so I mean, what are the consequences? The second question. Anything else from the audience? No. Perfect. Please, whoever wants to respond to those, along with, so wrap up. Dr. Kalpana first.
Just very quickly. Yeah. Global standards will always keep evolving, and global standards are converging. I think right now, for everybody, all of us in the room who is reporting, we should just focus on reporting as correctly and accurately as possible. There will never be more disclosure, more guidance than what we already have. So it's just up to each one of us to do what we are supposed to do, period. And even regulators, for that matter, or standard-setting bodies understand this is an evolving landscape. So the sooner we start, the sooner we'll get more and more mature, and the caravan keeps moving. Second, on your question, sir, absolutely. The key to that is having disclosures. So you have a lot of guidance today, much more so than ever before. Many more specific templates, specific, again, from global conversion. All of us need to disclose, and disclose against what we had committed to. So it is in our control. It is not appropriate for different stakeholders to say, oh, well, somebody hasn't given us a standard, somebody hasn't given us conversions. You will never get more than you have. And you have a ton more than you had even last year. So we all need to get cracking, get to work,
Thanks,
and
Scott.
evolve. Thank you.
Final word,
So
Scott.
I'll try to hit 4 things each in 10 seconds to keep this as quick as possible. So on the first question, it's important to remember that we are transitioning from the experimentation phase to the coordination phase. And these 2 things aren't sequential, they're happening at the same time. But it looks like over time, these are going to continue to converge, and hopefully we'll get one system with maybe some regional top-ups on that. On the second question, unless it's required to be assured, information can't really be trusted. You have to have your financial statements audited, and right now in the world, only a very small number of, I think, European jurisdictions, not even all of them, just France and Italy, require assurance on ESG reporting. We're getting to mandatory assurance on ESG reporting, and when we get there, then the information will be much more reliable.
Yeah. And if I may add, Scott, India's gone further on assurance and actually going to go from limited assurance to actually reasonable assurance for the top 150 companies from next year.
Yeah.
So the standards in India on some of this information being attested is even higher.
It's a huge leapfrog, exactly. So that's great to see, and the Indian market, capital markets will benefit as a result. I'll just make one last point on the overloaded disclosure point. When you have comparability, you can have computer analysis of the disclosures. No financial analyst or asset manager is reading all the annual reports. They're looking at the Bloomberg terminal and analyzing things en masse across companies. You can only get there when you have structured data that's comparable across companies. We don't have that now. So a world of global disclosures will get us to computer readable disclosures and analysis at that level, which obviously makes a fundamental difference in how ESG information can be used.
I just wanted to add one point to add to Scott's point of disclosures. This is something where financial institutions can and are indeed playing a role. In some sensitive sectors, for instance, we as lenders or arrangers of capital are requiring our clients to have reasonable assurance, and limited assurance will not do. And this is in line with your global standard setting bodies. This is what ICMA says in the Green Bond Principles and so on and so forth. But then we are the ones who actually implement our transactions, and we say it's not just our requirement being imposed on our clients. We tell our clients it's in your interest to get key data assured, period.
Thank you for that sales pitch for accountants and auditors like myself. Kalpana, thank you. John, go ahead.
So a simple point just to answer both questions, because this isn't just about compliance. I think the reality, of course what we need is one global language. We've only got one atmosphere, we've only got one environment we all share, particularly for climate. But underlying all of this, the real challenge we face as a society and as a business community is the capacity to do this and to do it properly, to do it with credibility. And I think all of these initiatives are building towards the ability and capability. We don't have those skills yet, but they're taking us in that direction. And the faster we build that capacity, the more able we're going to be to deal with all these challenges.
Thank you. Final words, Carla.
Thank you. And just to wrap it up and follow up what was already being said, I think sometimes we hear international standards and everybody thinks, oh, then we're done, great, that's the end. But it's really the beginning. I mean, kind of following up from what Scott said, sort of like where we have to be realistic of where we actually are in this process of implementation and disclosures, etc., and assurance, and where we are still lacking. And I think that it's particularly important when it comes to the greenwashing and the scandals, because sort of really speeding up this process and making sure that we're able to get there is essential, because we see that the term ESG is being politicized, right? I mean, there's a lot of criticism out there, and I think that comes from lack of clarity that really opens up for that. So I think it's really crucial that we stay, even if the AI is maybe the new big topic, to kind of stay on this and be able to kind of bring us over the line to demonstrate the impact that it can have. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. So I lied, that wasn't the last word, because I have to have the final word. To me, ESG is, if I step back from it, it is what we say at Grant Thornton, doing the right thing over doing what is easy, right? If you just think of that, it's doing the right thing over doing what is easy. That's the answer to your question, the ex-Swiss banker. That's the answer on convergence of standards. That's the answer on these choices we have to make, going forward from here. I would request all of you to please put your hands together for this fantastic panel, and also for yourselves for staying here till 6:15. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, with this, we conclude this session. We extend our heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed guests for the insightful discussion. I kindly request all our speakers to gather for a group photograph.